Hello, today we're going to talk about the Spanish Inquisition, specifically rethinking persecution, expulsion, and state power during the 15th century and the 16th century. So my thesis is the Spanish Inquisition was a genocidal process to systematically eliminate Jewish, conversos, heretical individuals from Spanish society through persecution, conversion, expulsion, or death. So interesting finding is the level of the pluralistic society that existed within the Iberian Peninsula. Um, you know, Emirate of Cordoba is the first major independent Islamic kingdom from the Middle East and Africa that took hold in the Iberian Peninsula. And they brought with them many things like social, political, and economical elements. And there was a level of coexistence between the different faiths and people of this region, over the generations. By the time we get to the 15th and 16th century, these individuals had been interacting with each other, been their neighbors, their friends for over 700 years. So, the interesting element that they brought with their social economical system and political system, they brought this concept of jiza. It was interesting to find out this actually came from, what is modern Middle East, Africa, where the Islamic State at this time usually is. So people that don't know what jiza is, it is specific taxes, you could say, on individuals who are non-Muslims, so the dhimma. And they pay this tax so they can practice their religion, keep their businesses, and not have to provide military service. Some degree with that element, but they wouldn't have to pay the tax if they, converted to Islam. But this was a way to not force conversion and still make a profit by, Islamic kingdom. And it showed coexistence and pluralism. It showed that Islam was accepting enough for these individuals to continue to practice their faith of choice, and we're not forced into conversion. So historically, there had been tensions over this. The coexistence, very fragile, always tense, because technically, if you want to look at it as the Islamic invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, which would put a historical tension existence within the peninsula itself. So that's an interesting topic. Pogrom is very interesting to me, of the one of 1391, because it's not the first time of mass violence, religious violence, let's say, in the Iberian Peninsula, but it was like a culminating one. And it's being led by prominent clergymen. That's really thought there's interesting. Ferran Martinez, he promotes violence, promotes destruction. He, blames the Jewish people for, all these problems that are happening. He's preying on these people, exploiting past tenses. One of the big elements is there's economic downturn. So it must be the Jewish people's fault because they're not as bad off because of this economic downturn. They still have money, they're still surviving, they're comfortable compared to the average population. So it must be, and he plays on exploiting those past historical tensions. Also, the very other interesting is that him, among many others, promoted violence and also justified it by utilizing the Bible, the words of Jesus Christ, the Gospels, and on top of that, employing that the monarchy as well supports this, which I found very interesting with the documentation of letters from the court of Castile, where individuals were reporting on Martinez for these heinous actions and imploring the crown was in support of it. which is very interesting because the crown was not. So, so the historical tensions are going to continue to exist, and they're going to rise, go back and forth, um, being determined by natural disaster, economic downturn. But eventually, time is going to develop. Very interesting element of unified Spain of 1469. It is done through marriage of Isabel and Ferdinand. I was unaware that once the unification happened, it truly wasn't unified. It was still government structures of Castile and Aragon. Granada still exists. So it appears like the unification of Spain was not complete in 1469, and there was going to need something to really truly unify Spain. So by 1492, Granada had been defeated. The Iberian Peninsula is free of any major Muslim kingdoms. So they produced the Alhambra Decree, also known as Edict's Expulsion. This was very interesting findings because it very much lays out what the crown says will be the procedures going forward. This is an edict of expulsion. They target the Jewish people specifically more than any others, and within it, it says you convert, you remove yourself from the Iberian Peninsula, or specifically Spain, or you die. There is no middle. And if you're removed, you have property confiscation. If you die, you have property confiscation. And I didn't like realize to such a high degree there was options. It's very interesting. But even with options of conversion and expulsion and even death, those all interplay with concept of genocide. So it doesn't mean that if you convert, it's not genocide. If they leave, it's not genocide. If they die, usually people think of genocide as more with death, the loss of life, but it's not the case. So the conversos, they're very targeted as well. Even the individuals that are converted are targeted. These people are losing their culture. There's a reason they're targeted because this old historical tension between these different people. I found it very interesting of the blood purity element, the superstition of the converts, usually interconnected with le besoin de sangre, which is blood purity. This is very, to me, interesting because it reflected a lot on Nazi Germany and their whole look at if someone was Jewish. You had to go back X amount of generation to be considered not Jewish. And this is what is happening during the Spanish Inquisition as well. You have to go back X amount of generations to appear if you're Jewish or not. But the interesting element of this is that till you're part of that generation that you cannot hold governmental office. So they limit the ability of certain people, certain culture or previous culture to be in a place of power. So to me, there's a lot of interconnection here with Nazi Germany. So here's a quick timeline of what I covered. So 756 to the mid 16th century, more focused on the codification. So I didn't go too far because the Spanish Inquisition lasts centuries, and I did not do that. So the question is, my findings really did tell me that it is a genocide, a systematic genocide, if you want to put it. I think we can see that the Spanish Inquisition was a genocidal process, systematically eliminating these people. There's many ties, with Nazi Germany and the Armenian genocide. Displacement, expulsion, death, and surveillance based off of religion. So the other question is how deep of a connection of why this happened? What really caused at that time the exploitation of this tension? Why eventually they moved away from, you know, Judaism, Islam into making the purity of, Christianity from to, purely Catholicism. So this is a bunch of my references. And I just want to put in there the most helpful resources I used were primary. Album Decree was a primary focus to make my argument.